Hey guys, welcome back to episode 2 of PPG Radio. Today we're going to be getting into the meat and potatoes of what we talked about in our last video, which is conditioning. First things first, I want to thank the very first sponsor of the podcast. We're very excited to have them on. The CCP is going to be our first sponsor. The Chinese Communist Party and I sat down together and had a very good meeting. We were able to meet with several of their representatives, and we really felt like we had a lot of synergy. We had the same vision, we had the same goals, and once the CCP is able to successfully subvert every meaningful institution in the United States and begin to enslave the population, as you can imagine, they're going to want strong, fit slave labor. You don't want weak people falling over in lithium mines and coughing up blood and hurting their backs, and it's just not good for productivity. So I really felt like it was a good match for the podcast, a good match for the channel, and so go ahead and support the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in any way you can. Get out there to Walmart, to Amazon, buy their products. They're pretty much everywhere. They're hard to miss. So big shout out to the CCP. Thanks for becoming the first sponsor of the Physical Preparedness Group radio show. Now on with the show. In the last episode, we discussed the importance of conditioning and how it's really a weakness, at least it seems to me, in the preparedness community. A lot of people like to lift. It's really fun to lift, but they don't take their conditioning nearly as seriously as they do their lifting. It's just kind of an afterthought. And that's a serious problem that we need to remedy as soon as possible. And so I'm hoping that as we break down the types of conditioning that we're going to be talking about and ways that you can train it, you're able to get some ideas as to how you can start implementing training more consistently and with a little bit more intensity into your training so that it's not just an afterthought and kind of something you do once in a while. We're going to be breaking conditioning down into 3 different categories for just ease of discussion, but it's important to remember that the body does not react to different types of training in neat preset categories. It's all a matter of degrees, and very often by working on one physical attribute, you will improve other physical attributes, and as you become a more advanced athlete, that becomes less and less true, and you need to be more specific with your training. But for general population athletes, by working on one attribute, you do very often improve your abilities in others. So to break it down into the 3 categories, we have long duration endurance, which we're going to define as doing something for a long period of time with no rest. And traditionally, that means something longer than an hour. But in the context of you training long duration endurance, you're not always going to be able to train something for an hour straight. And so it can be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. It can be an hour or more, but it's going to be something that's long, and it's going to be something where you don't take any breaks. The second type of endurance is going to be more of a speed power endurance, where you're able to replicate a high amount of force production over a long period of time. Just as an example, throwing punches on a heavy bag for 20 minutes. You're throwing punches and you're producing force, you're throwing them hard and fast, and then you're resting for a second, and then you're re-engaging. Another example would be sprinting, where you're running close to your maximum speed, and then you're resting for however long, and then you're going back and doing a similarly explosive bout. And so that's going to be defined by some type of exercise where there's a high amount of speed, high amount of force output, followed by rest, but you still do it for a relatively long period of time. The third category is going to be strength endurance, and that is going to be categorized less by speed and more just by force output or power output. It can be defined different ways, but essentially you might think of a situation like grappling, where there's a lot of pulling, there's a lot of pushing, there's a lot of isometric holds, which are essentially just squeezing something in place, holding it in place. Any of you guys who have done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or wrestling know that there's a lot of that involved, or you could also include something like a very heavy ruck run or walk or something else. But those are our three basic categories that we're going to be breaking things down into as we go along. And I think by breaking those things down, it's going to be a little bit easier to conceptualize for you guys, and hopefully a little bit easier to take away some points that you can actually use at home. Before we get into the specifics, I want to discuss why it's so crucial that we need to be doing some type of conditioning, even if you're not super detailed and you're not getting into, the specific categories that we've discussed. Just to be doing something with a moderate to high level of intensity at least once or twice a week, whether it's running or some sort of martial art or swimming or some type of CrossFit metabolic conditioning workout. It really, at least in the beginning, is not that important what you do. It's just really important that you do something. It occurs to me as I talk with athletes and I kind of ask them what their goals are, and I talk to guys who are big into training with firearms and they're maybe wanting to get into some martial arts, and they've got violence on their mind, for lack of a better phrase. And that's kind of what we're all anticipating, is that we want to be ready for violence, we want to be ready for disaster. And lifting and being strong is a very important part of that, and there's a long list of health benefits that come from lifting. Like I discussed in the last video, I started off as solely a powerlifting coach, a strength-focused coach. And so I'm not anti-strength at all. I love strength training, but the problem is that I think we get a little bit of a false perception as to our abilities mentally and physically when all we do is strength training, and we leave out conditioning and we don't really push ourselves as hard in the conditioning. On social media, it's very common to hear people discuss mental toughness. It's very common for people to talk about resiliency physically and mentally, which is something that can be built with strength training and lifting weights. But you have to conceptualize it like this. How hard can you push yourself when you're deadlifting 400 or 500 pounds? I mean, you might be able to do a couple reps, couple sets, or even if we're talking about 200 pounds, you might be able to cut down on rest times, up the reps, and make things a little bit harder. But realistically, your back or your shoulder is going to give out on these exercises very often before your mental fortitude does, simply because the load is so high that we're using on that exercise. And so for us to build up not just physical endurance, but mental endurance and mental resiliency, I think it's important that we get into exercise like sprinting, running, swimming, burpees, martial arts, things like that. Things where the load is relatively low compared to some of our maximal strength work. And it's something that we can do safely for hundreds, if not thousands of repetitions, and we're able to push ourselves and get into places that are so fatiguing and so uncomfortable that they really force us to grow mentally and force us to get into places that we wouldn't normally be able to get into with strength training. And again, that's not to bag on strength training, because I love it. I think we just need to accept what some of the limitations are. So if we're talking about preparing for worst case scenarios and we're talking about becoming more mentally tough and you're not doing conditioning, I really think that there's a dangerous possibility that you're not being honest with yourself as far as how hard you're working in the gym and how hard you're pushing yourself physically. So it's really important that as we get into the specifics of how to train these different types of endurance, that you keep that in mind, that this is absolutely essential to you not just being physically resilient and able to perform, but I think mentally resilient and able to perform. And so I hope you guys are able to take that or keep that in mind as we go into the next videos. I'm sorry we haven't gotten into the specifics of training, but I really wanted to set this up and specify why it's so important before we get into the details. because it seems to me that there's a lot of people that just don't care about conditioning, but they want to be prepared for worst case scenarios. So there's a little bit of an intellectual gap there that I'm hoping to bridge. So please stay tuned. In the next video, we will get into the meat and potatoes and specifics of training, how to set up your training, and how to address those different types of endurance. Stay tuned. I'm most likely going to be posting that tomorrow. Please like, subscribe so you don't miss it, and I will see you then.